The hum of the private jet's engines was a steady, soothing pulse that matched the rhythmic tap of polished leather shoes on the sleek cabin floor. The interior of the jet gleamed in the soft, ambient lighting, designed to exude luxury and exclusivity. Plush seats, each made of the finest materials, were arranged in a layout that offered both privacy and comfort, and the air smelled faintly of fresh flowers, a subtle touch that screamed opulence. The soft murmur of the crew could be heard as they moved about, preparing for departure, ensuring everything was perfect for the wealthy passengers on board. It was a morning flight, a crisp January day that promised to be full of surprises, though no one could have known just how dramatically the atmosphere aboard this jet would change. In the front of the cabin, two passengers already sat. One was an older man, his features worn with age but still carrying an undeniable presence. He was dressed simply, but his clothes were expensive in their understated way. His hands rested gently on the armrests, his eyes closed in quiet contemplation. To anyone else, he would have looked like any other elderly man, perhaps someone on their way to visit family, someone who had lived a full life and was simply passing time. But those who knew him would recognize him instantly. An elusive billionaire, an industry giant whose name was known in every corner of the business world. But that, of course, was not the reality the world saw. To those around him, he was just another elderly traveler on a private jet. And then there was the other man. He swaggered down the narrow aisle with the confidence of someone accustomed to attention, his presence almost palpable. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that didn't quite fit the easy, casual nature of a private flight. His jawline was sharp, his gaze unyielding, scanning the cabin with the kind of arrogance that only someone who believed they were entitled to everything could possess. His eyes fell on the old man occupying the seat near the window, and without a second thought, he approached, his footsteps louder than necessary on the pristine floor. "Hey, old man, get up. That's my seat," the young man snapped, his voice harsh, cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. His tone was laced with the kind of entitlement that came from years of getting what he wanted without question. The elderly man didn't stir. His eyes remained closed, a slight smile on his lips, as if the world and its irritations no longer held sway over him. "You heard me. Get up. That's my seat," the young man repeated, now more insistent, his voice rising slightly. He was clearly annoyed by the lack of immediate response. His posture straightened, arms folding across his chest as he glared down at the seated man, ready to escalate the situation. At first, there was nothing from the older man. No reaction, no acknowledgement. It was as if he hadn't heard the young man at all. And then, very slowly, his eyes opened, not with the sharpness one might expect from someone who had been insulted, but with a calm, knowing look that suggested he had seen much worse in his time. The young man stood there for a moment, waiting, his impatience growing as seconds ticked by. The soft hum of the engines was the only sound filling the space between them. Finally, the elderly man spoke, his voice low but unmistakably clear. "This seat is taken, young man. Perhaps you should check your reservation." His words were measured, calm, and yet there was something beneath them, a quiet authority that the young man could not quite place. The arrogant man scowled, a flash of annoyance flickering in his eyes. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but this is my seat. I'm not going to ask you again." The elderly man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the words hang in the air, the tension building around them like a storm just waiting to break. His eyes, though soft with age, seemed to carry an undercurrent of something much more powerful than simple resignation. The young man, oblivious to the weight of the situation, was too caught up in his own frustration to notice. He was only focused on his perceived right to this seat, this space, as though it was owed to him. "Move," the young man insisted, his voice growing sharper. He reached out, intending to shove the older man aside, but his hand stopped midair, just inches from the elderly figure. For a brief moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The crew, who had been quietly watching from the periphery, exchanged wary glances, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Some might have thought it was just another flight of nerves or arrogance, but there was something unsettling about the quiet tension that had begun to settle like a heavy fog. No one knew yet how deeply this encounter would spiral. The elderly man finally stood up, not with the jerky movements of someone caught off guard, but with a grace that belied his years. Slowly, he rose, and as he did, the young man's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping into his gaze. For the first time, he wondered if he had miscalculated. Perhaps, the elderly man said, his voice unwavering, you should choose your battles more carefully. The young man, taken aback for just a moment, opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. He was about to face someone who wasn't what he seemed, and he had no idea that the world around him was about to turn upside down. The young man stood motionless for a moment, his hands still hanging in midair as the elderly man slowly stepped aside. For all his bravado and arrogance, something in the calmness of the older man's movements unsettled him. There was no flustered apology, no fear, just a quiet, almost imperceptible shift of power that made the young man's chest tighten with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. He didn't know why, but he felt as if something important had just passed between them, something that he didn't fully understand. The elderly man nodded to the seat beside him, an almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. Sit, if you must, he said, his voice still carrying that strange authority, like someone who had long since seen the worst of human nature and had learned not to flinch. The young man hesitated, then glared. I don't want to sit next to you, he snapped, his pride unwilling to let him take a less than ideal seat. He'd already been insulted, and he wasn't about to let the old man get the better of him. I'll find somewhere else. He turned sharply and walked down the aisle, making a point of choosing a seat far from the elderly man. As he sat, he shot a glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see the old man still watching him, still waiting. But the elderly man had already turned his attention back to the window, his posture relaxed, as if nothing had happened. For a moment, the young man's thoughts were clouded with anger. His pulse raced with indignation. He didn't like being dismissed. He didn't like being challenged. But beneath the anger, there was something else, a subtle sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. It gnawed at him, making his fingers twitch nervously along the armrest of his chair. He had grown used to being the one in control, to having people cater to his whims. But here, on this jet, with this man, there was no such privilege. It was as if the rules of the world had been bent, and he had no idea how to navigate this new, unnerving territory. The flight continued without incident at first, the gentle hum of the engines and the soft chatter of the crew blending into a lull that made the time pass more quickly than expected. The young man found himself trying to concentrate on his phone, scrolling through social media, distracted by the constant flood of information and images. Yet no matter how many articles he read or posts he skimmed, his mind kept drifting back to the elderly man seated in the front of the cabin. Who was he? He wasn't just some old man traveling in luxury. The more the young man thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. The way he had spoken, the air of quiet authority surrounding him, it didn't match the image of a typical elderly traveler. This wasn't someone who could be brushed off or disregarded. The young man glanced up again, this time allowing his gaze to linger a little longer. The older man still sat there, staring out the window, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. There was something about him that suggested a deep well of experience, something he couldn't quite place but felt inexplicably drawn to. That feeling of unease settled deeper into his chest. He reached into his bag and pulled out his phone again, swiping through the digital pages of his life. His career, his social status, the image he had built for himself. He had worked hard to get where he was, to build this life of wealth and privilege. He didn't just deserve it, he had earned it. And yet, there was something about the old man that made him feel small in comparison. As the minutes dragged on, the young man found himself watching him again, noticing more details now. The older man was wearing a simple but impeccably tailored jacket, nothing too flashy, but it fit him perfectly. His shoes, while not ostentatious, were polished to a shine, and his watch was discreet, but unmistakably expensive. The young man's mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. There was no way that this man, with his quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance, wasn't someone important. But who? The curiosity gnawed at him until it was unbearable. Unable to stop himself, He stood up and walked over to the elderly man's seat again, this time with a different intention. He was determined to break the silence, to force some kind of interaction, to expose the truth behind the mystery. "All right, old man," the young man said, his voice a little more measured now, but still carrying the same underlying arrogance. "Who are you? Really? What's your deal?" The elderly man didn't immediately respond, his gaze still fixed on the window, but the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I told you already," he said softly, still not looking at the younger man. "Perhaps you should be more careful about who you choose to provoke." The words landed like a sudden slap to the young man's pride. He felt the familiar sting of being put in his place again, and it made him angry, but also strangely intrigued. There was something undeniably captivating about the older man's calmness, his sense of self-assurance. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you should know this. I don't let people get away with things like this," the young man snapped, trying to regain some semblance of control. At that, the elderly man finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto the younger man's with a quiet intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a calm certainty. "I don't play games," the elderly man said, his voice slow, deliberate. "I built an empire. I don't need to prove anything to anyone." The words struck the young man like a blow. He froze, the reality of the moment crashing into him. He suddenly realized just how wrong he had been, how much he had underestimated this man. It wasn't just a feeling of unease anymore. It was a cold wave of realization washing over him. He had just insulted someone who might very well be his superior in ways he could never understand. The elderly man's gaze softened ever so slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "But remember this, there are consequences to arrogance. You don't know who you're speaking to." The young man was silent for a long moment, his mind struggling to process the implications of the conversation. As the flight continued, the tension between them grew palpable, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. Both men, caught in their own internal struggles, couldn't escape the truth of their interactions. The old man, with his quiet wisdom and unassuming power, had already made his peace with the world. But the young man, proud, arrogant, and driven, was still locked in a battle with forces much larger than he could comprehend. Outside, the clouds thickened as the plane soared higher into the sky, a storm brewing on the horizon, both in the world outside and within the hearts of its passengers. The plane had been in the air for a while now, its hum becoming a distant background to the tension that had been building between the two men. The once peaceful atmosphere had dissolved, replaced by an undercurrent of unease that neither man could escape. The young man, still stewing in his anger and confusion, was unable to shake the feeling that the elderly passenger was somehow more than he appeared, more than anyone could truly understand. The more he thought about it, the more unsettling the entire encounter became. He could feel the shift in the air, a weight pressing down on him that he couldn't quite place. The elderly man, on the other hand, seemed utterly unaffected by the young man's behavior, though something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, hinted that he too was aware of the tension between them. He sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap, eyes half closed as if he were simply waiting for the moment to pass. And yet, deep inside, his thoughts were anything but serene. He had seen this kind of arrogance before. The young man's reckless confidence was familiar in the way it threatened to unravel itself, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. As the minutes stretched into hours, the plane began its descent toward its destination. The sky outside had grown darker, thick clouds gathering around them, a storm in the distance that mirrored the storm inside the cabin. The weather, it seemed, was intent on matching the rising tension within the small, confined space. The moment came suddenly, without warning, like a spark igniting a powder keg. It started with a loud, violent thud, too loud to ignore. The plane shuddered, throwing everyone in the cabin off balance for a split second. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the interior. The crew moved quickly, their movements quick but controlled, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are encountering some turbulence, but it's nothing to worry about. We'll be through it shortly." But the words did nothing to calm the rising panic in the young man's chest. He wasn't one to panic easily, not with his polished exterior, but the sensation of the plane dipping again, a sudden lurch that made his stomach lurch with it, sent his nerves into overdrive. His heart began to race, and before he even realized it, he was standing, gripping the armrest of his seat as if it would anchor him to the world. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice betraying the panic that was bubbling just beneath the surface. The flight attendants continued their calm but insistent movements, assuring passengers to remain in their seats, but the young man couldn't focus. His mind was too scattered, his thoughts racing faster than the turbulence outside. He glanced back at the elderly man, who was still sitting there, serene, unfazed, looking out the window as if nothing had changed. It infuriated him. How could he be so calm? Didn't he feel it? The world was spinning out of control, and yet the old man was unmoved, as though this was just another day in his life. "Hey!" the young man shouted, his voice rising in irritation. "Can't you feel this? You're not even worried?" The elderly man turned his head slowly, his gaze locking with the younger man's. There was no fear in his eyes, only quiet understanding. "No," he said simply. "I've been through worse." The words hit the young man like a slap, and for a moment, the noise of the plane, the thunderous roar of the engines, the rattling of the seats, seemed to fade away. The statement lingered in the air, sharp and heavy, as if the old man had just revealed a secret the young man wasn't ready to hear. The older man's calmness, his stoic acceptance, was something the young man couldn't grasp. But just as quickly as the moment had arrived, the plane jolted again, this time with even greater intensity. A loud, terrifying screech filled the cabin as the engines seemed to sputter, and for an instant, the entire world seemed to tilt sideways. People screamed. The flight attendants rushed to secure passengers, but it was too late. The plane was falling, spiraling out of control. Time seemed to stretch, the minutes blending into seconds, and every heartbeat felt like a lifetime. The young man's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as his seatbelt strained against him. He reached out instinctively, his hands grabbing at the armrest again, his mind unable to process what was happening. His thoughts were frantic, disjointed, as fear overtook him. He looked around in a daze, the screams of fellow passengers piercing his consciousness like shards of glass. This was it. This was the moment he had feared but never truly believed could happen. His life, his carefully constructed world, was crashing down around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the midst of the chaos, he turned back to the elderly man, his mouth dry with terror. For a moment, he thought the old man might be as frightened as everyone else, that he might panic like the others. But he didn't. The elderly man was sitting in his seat, calmly observing the scene with the same quiet demeanor he had shown earlier. "How?" the young man gasped, his voice trembling. "How are you so calm?" The old man turned toward him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something more in his eyes, something deeper, more calculating, more terrifying. "Because I know what comes next," he said quietly, "and you don't." The words cut through the young man's panic like a knife. The realization hit him like a cold wave. He had no idea who this man really was. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance that he hadn't seen the truth staring him in the face. The elderly man wasn't just an ordinary passenger. He wasn't some frail, insignificant figure in a seat. He was someone who had lived through things the young man couldn't even imagine. And now, the young man would have to face the consequences of his actions. In the chaos of the moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The plane continued its terrifying descent, the turbulence unrelenting, but something had shifted. The young man was no longer the one in control, no longer the one who could command attention or manipulate a situation. The balance of power had completely shifted, and it was only a matter of time before he would understand exactly how much his fate had changed. Outside the window, the sky darkened even further, the storm now a swirling mass of clouds. The light from the cabin flickered and buzzed, adding to the sense of unreality. The young man's heart raced in his chest, his mind reeling, but all he could focus on was the elderly man beside him, the man who knew what would happen next. And suddenly, He realized with terrifying clarity that he had no idea how this would end. The descent continued, the moment holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable climax to unfold. The chaos that had erupted inside the plane slowly began to subside, though the remnants of fear and confusion clung to the air like smoke. The shaking had stopped. The jolting turbulence that had once felt like the end of everything now faded into the distant hum of the engines, which had somehow stabilized. The crew moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, ensuring that everyone was safe, but the silence that followed was deafening. The young man, still strapped into his seat, stared at the elderly man, unable to tear his eyes away. The terror that had once gripped him had given way to something else, something far more unsettling. The elderly man had known. He had known this would happen, and the young man had been blind to it, blind to the fact that he had been in the presence of someone far beyond his comprehension. As the plane continued its flight, steady once more, the young man's mind raced. He couldn't focus. He tried to make sense of the moment. How had it all gone so wrong so quickly? Why had he provoked the old man? He thought back to their exchange, to his arrogant words, and the way the elderly man had met them with nothing more than a quiet smile. How had the old man known the turbulence was coming? Had he orchestrated this? Or was it just a coincidence? He didn't know, and it terrified him. The young man leaned back in his seat, his heart still pounding, but the fear now felt different. It was replaced with guilt, a gnawing, relentless feeling that he couldn't shake. He had been so quick to dismiss the elderly man, so eager to prove his superiority, and now he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The old man was not some frail, harmless passenger. He was a force, someone who had lived a life the young man could never imagine, someone whose every word carried weight, and whose quiet confidence had been a warning the young man had ignored. For the first time, the young man felt small. The elderly man sat beside him, as calm as ever. His face was still impassive, though there was something in his eyes now, something that spoke of a lifetime of experiences, of battles fought, of lessons learned the hard way. It wasn't pride in his gaze, but rather a quiet understanding, a recognition that the young man would come to see the truth in time. The flight attendants walked by, giving their final reassurances to the passengers, but the young man barely noticed them. His attention was entirely on the elderly man. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out before he even realized he was speaking them. The old man turned his head slowly, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the young man felt as if the entire weight of the world had settled on him. The old man didn't respond immediately, as if weighing the sincerity of the apology. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "It's not about being sorry," the elderly man said softly. "It's about understanding." The young man swallowed, his throat tight. Understanding? How could he possibly understand everything the old man had lived through? How could he possibly comprehend the choices, the decisions, the sacrifices that had shaped this quiet, powerful figure sitting beside him? "I don't understand," the young man muttered. "I don't know how you stayed so calm. I don't know how you knew what would happen." The old man smiled faintly, almost as if he were amused. "It's not about knowing what would happen. It's about knowing that you can't control everything. Sometimes, you just have to ride it out, accept the consequences of your actions, and keep moving forward." The young man felt a lump rise in his throat. He had always thought he was in control. He had built his life on the belief that he could manipulate any situation, that he could bend the world to his will. But now, in the wake of everything that had just happened, that belief seemed fragile, like a house of cards that had collapsed in on itself. As the plane began its descent toward the airport, the young man remained silent, his thoughts churning in a turbulent storm of regret. He realized that nothing would be the same after this. The fear, the arrogance, the quiet power of the elderly man. It had all shifted something deep inside him. For the first time, he questioned the life he had built, the facade of success, the belief that he could control everything. He wasn't sure where he stood anymore. The plane touched down smoothly, and the passengers, though shaken, began to slowly gather their belongings and prepare to disembark. The young man remained in his seat, not ready to leave, not ready to face the world outside. The elderly man stood without a word, smoothing his jacket, as if the events of the flight hadn't affected him in the slightest. "Thank you," the young man whispered, his voice barely audible. The old man glanced back, his expression unreadable. "Remember," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "arrogance will only take you so far." With that, the elderly man walked down the aisle, leaving the young man alone with his thoughts. In the aftermath of the flight, the young man's life began to unravel. He returned to his world of power and privilege, but everything felt different now. The people around him didn't seem as impressive as they once had. The deals, the successes, the endless stream of accolades. None of it felt like it mattered anymore. His perception had shifted irrevocably. He found himself questioning everything. His decisions, his ambitions, the way he had treated others, particularly the elderly man. He began to recognize the arrogance that had guided his actions and the deep loneliness that had followed him even in the midst of his wealth. The mask he had worn so carefully was slipping, and he was forced to confront the truth. Beneath the surface, he was just as vulnerable as anyone else. The repercussions didn't stop at his personal reflections. The young man's relationships began to deteriorate. His business partners noticed the shift in his attitude. Once brash and domineering, he now questioned his choices, often second-guessing his every move. His friends, those who had once flattered him and fed his ego, began to pull away. There was a visible change in him, a subtle, uncomfortable shift that left others unsure of how to react. But perhaps the most painful consequence came from within. The young man couldn't escape the memory of the elderly man's words, the quiet strength that had unsettled him. It wasn't just a passing encounter. It had left a mark on him, a mark that he could never erase. The weight of that encounter followed him into his every decision, a reminder that there was a world beyond his own, a world of wisdom, experience, and consequences. As the days turned into weeks, the young man found himself searching for meaning beyond the surface level of wealth and success. The old man had shown him that there was more to life than power. There was understanding, there was humility, and there was the painful truth that sometimes the most powerful people were the ones who didn't need to prove it. For the first time in his life, the young man began to see the world in a different light. As the weeks passed, the young man found himself slipping further away from the world he had once ruled. He had tried, at first, to return to his old life, to bury the encounter with the elderly man as nothing more than a fleeting moment of turbulence, both literal and metaphorical. But every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the reflection of someone who had been irrevocably changed, someone who could no longer wear the mask of arrogance he had so carefully cultivated for years. His business dealings began to suffer. Partners who had once eagerly sought his approval now hesitated, sensing a shift in his demeanor. He was no longer the aggressive, take-no-prisoners type that had once bulldozed his way to success. Instead, he found himself questioning every decision, every move. The confidence that had once been his strongest asset had morphed into self-doubt, and with each passing day, it became clearer that something had irrevocably shifted within him. The pressure mounted, and he found himself isolating. Friends and colleagues, sensing the change, pulled away, unsure how to interact with the man he had become. Those who had admired his ambition now saw only a shell of the person they had once idolized. His reputation, so carefully constructed on the pillars of arrogance, wealth, and control, began to crumble. He wasn't just losing his grip on his business. He was losing himself. Despite the turmoil, there was one thing that he couldn't shake: the memory of the elderly man's calm, the quiet wisdom in his eyes, the strength in his silence. The young man found himself obsessing over those moments. He replayed the encounter over and over in his mind, searching for answers, hoping for some understanding of the man who had, without a word, stripped away his illusions and forced him to confront his own vulnerability. It was in the middle of one of these late-night reflections that he received a letter, a simple, unmarked envelope that arrived at his office. He opened it slowly, almost afraid of what he might find inside. The letter was short, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "You're not the first to believe that power comes from control. You won't be the last to learn the hard way that true power lies in letting go. It's never too late to start anew." The signature at the bottom was simple, M. It wasn't much, just a few lines, but it was enough. He knew, without a doubt, that the letter was from the elderly man. It wasn't a reminder of his failure. It was a gentle nudge, a reminder that there was more to life than what he had known. The words were not harsh or condescending, but rather reflective, like the old man was speaking from a place of understanding rather than judgment. The young man sat in his office for hours after reading the letter, letting the words settle in his mind. He realized that the elderly man hadn't just been trying to teach him humility or caution. He had been showing him a different way to live, one that didn't revolve around dominance or control, but one that embraced vulnerability, self-awareness, and the understanding that power was not something to be wielded over others, but something to be shared with the world in humility. As time went on, the young man made the decision to step away from the world that had once defined him. He sold the majority of his businesses, not out of desperation, but out of choice. He no longer felt the need to prove himself through wealth or influence. Instead, he began working on projects that aligned with his values, initiatives that focused on sustainability, community, and ethical business practices. It was a slow process, one that took time and introspection, but gradually, he found a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. His relationships began to change as well. The friends who had drifted away returned, not because of his wealth or status, but because they saw a man who was more genuine, more present, and more willing to listen. He learned to value those connections for the right reasons, not because of what they could do for him, but because of the shared experiences they could offer. But perhaps the most profound change was within himself. He no longer viewed the world through the lens of competition or conquest. Instead, he began to see it as a place where people, despite their flaws, could make a difference. He realized that the elderly man, in his quiet wisdom, had not just exposed his weaknesses, but had shown him the path to becoming something more, something better. The old man's words had taken root, and they had transformed him. Power, he now understood, wasn't about control or manipulation. It was about understanding. Understanding oneself, understanding others, and understanding that there was no greater strength than knowing when to let go. As for the elderly man, his name and identity remained a mystery. The young man had searched for him after the flight, but no trace of him could be found. It was as if the old man had disappeared into the ether, leaving behind only a trail of profound lessons and unanswered questions. Perhaps he was a phantom, a figure who appeared when he was most needed, to teach a lesson that could only be learned in a moment of crisis. Or perhaps he was someone who had lived a lifetime of experiences so vast and intricate that his true identity could never be fully understood. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was the change he had set in motion. The young man was no longer the arrogant, self-assured figure who had once mocked the elderly passenger. He was something different now, something humbler, something wiser. And as he looked out at the world, with all its challenges and uncertainties, he knew that he had taken the first steps toward truly understanding what it meant to live with purpose. The elderly man had been right. It was never too late to start anew. As you reflect on this story, remember, the journey towards self-discovery is often sparked by moments of confrontation, moments that challenge our perceptions and force us to look deeper. Power is not defined by what we can control, but by what we choose to release. And true wisdom comes from knowing that we don't have all the answers. Sometimes, we just need to listen and learn. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and stay humble.